The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured gardens of Buckingham Palace as Thomas Mitchell adjusted his crisp red uniform for what he believed would be another routine day. After 15 years serving as a royal guard, he had witnessed countless ceremonies, state dinners, and private moments within the palace walls. But nothing had prepared him for what he would discover on this particular Tuesday morning in October. Thomas had always prided himself on his discretion and loyalty. Born into a military family in Yorkshire, he had dreamed of serving the crown since childhood. His father had been a sergeant in the Queen's Guard, and his grandfather before him had served during World War II. The Mitchell family had royal service running through their veins like blue blood through the monarchy itself. At 38 years old, Thomas had earned the respect of his fellow guards and the trust of the royal household staff. He was known for his attention to detail, his unwavering professionalism, and his ability to remain invisible when necessary. These qualities had earned him assignments to some of the most sensitive areas of the palace, including the private wings where the royal family conducted their personal affairs away from public scrutiny. Queen Camilla had always been cordial to Thomas during their brief interactions. She would offer a polite nod when passing in the corridors, and occasionally she would ask about his family during longer encounters. Thomas's wife, Sarah, worked as a nurse at a London hospital, and they had two children, Emily and James, aged 12 and 9 respectively. The Queen had once inquired about Emily's piano lessons after overhearing Thomas mention them to another guard. On this particular morning, Thomas had been assigned to the East Wing, where Queen Camilla maintained her private study. The assignment was routine: stand at the designated post, monitor access to the area, and ensure the Queen's privacy and security. What made this morning different was an unexpected change in the Queen's schedule. She had been called away suddenly for an emergency meeting with her private secretary regarding a charity foundation she patronized. As Thomas stood at his post, he noticed unusual activity in the corridor. Palace staff members were moving with more urgency than usual, and there seemed to be hushed conversations taking place in corners and alcoves. The atmosphere felt charged with an energy that Thomas couldn't quite identify, but his military training had taught him to pay attention to such subtle changes in environment. Around 10:30 in the morning, Thomas observed a man he didn't recognize entering the private study area. The stranger was well-dressed in an expensive suit, carrying a leather briefcase, and moved with the confidence of someone who belonged in such prestigious surroundings. However, Thomas's extensive knowledge of regular visitors to the Queen's private areas told him this man was not part of the usual circle. Following protocol, Thomas approached the visitor to verify his authorization to be in the restricted area. The man identified himself as David Hartwell, claiming to be a private financial advisor who had been summoned by Queen Camilla for an urgent consultation. He produced what appeared to be official documentation, complete with royal seals and signatures that looked authentic to Thomas's trained eye. However, something about the situation didn't feel right. Thomas had not been informed of any scheduled meetings, and the emergency protocols that had been put in place for the Queen's sudden departure should have included briefings about any expected visitors. Despite his growing unease, the documentation appeared legitimate, and Thomas was faced with a difficult decision. David Hartwell seemed nervous, constantly checking his watch and glancing around the corridor as if expecting someone to appear at any moment. His hands trembled slightly as he held the papers, and Thomas noticed perspiration on his forehead despite the cool temperature maintained throughout the palace. These physical signs of anxiety contradicted the confident demeanor the man was attempting to project against his better judgment, but following the apparent authority of the documentation, Thomas allowed David Hartwell to enter Queen Camilla's private study. The decision would haunt him for the rest of his life, as he realized he had just made a choice that would set in motion a series of events that would shake the very foundations of the monarchy. Inside the study, David Hartwell moved quickly to a particular section of the Queen's personal filing system. He seemed to know exactly where to look, suggesting that his visit was not as spontaneous as he claimed. Using a small electronic device, he photographed several documents before Thomas's growing suspicion finally overcame his respect for apparent authority. Thomas entered the study just as David Hartwell was photographing what appeared to be personal correspondence marked with the highest levels of confidentiality. The documents bore the private seal of Queen Camilla and appear to contain information that was never meant to leave the confines of the royal household. "Sir, I need you to step away from those documents immediately, Thomas commanded, his training taking over as he assessed the situation as a potential security breach. David Hartwell spun around, his face flushed with panic and guilt. In his hands were photographs of documents that Thomas could see contained references to financial transactions, personal communications, and what appeared to be sensitive information about other members of the royal family. The gravity of the situation hit Thomas like a physical blow as he realized he was witnessing what could only be described as espionage against the crown. "You don't understand," David Hartwell stammered, his composure completely shattered. "This information needs to be exposed. The public has a right to know what's really happening behind these palace walls." Thomas's mind raced as he processed the implications of what he was witnessing. His loyalty to the crown warred with a growing curiosity about what information could be so damaging that someone would risk breaking into the Queen's private study to obtain it. The documents in Hartwell's possession seemed to contain references to financial irregularities, private communications that contradicted public statements, and details about relationships within the royal family that painted a very different picture from the carefully crafted public image. "Whatever you think you're doing, this is treason," Thomas said, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his mind. "I'm going to have to ask you to surrender those photographs and come with me immediately." David Hartwell's response was not what Thomas expected. Instead of the defiance or denial he anticipated, the man's shoulders slumped in defeat, and tears began to form in his eyes. "You have no idea what you're protecting," he whispered. "The information in these documents, it changes everything about what the public believes about Queen Camilla and her role in this family." As Thomas moved to secure the intruder and the compromised documents, he caught a glimpse of one of the photograph papers that had fallen to the floor. What he saw in that brief moment would forever change his perception of the royal family he had sworn to protect. The document appeared to be a private communication discussing financial arrangements that seemed inconsistent with the royal family's public statements about their wealth and its sources. The weight of the moment pressed down on Thomas as he realized he was no longer just a guard protecting the monarchy. He had become an unwitting participant in a situation that could potentially expose secrets that the royal family had gone to great lengths to keep hidden. The loyalty that had defined his entire adult life was now being tested in ways he had never imagined possible. As he secured David Hartwell and began to assess the full extent of the security breach, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that his discovery was just the beginning of a much larger and more complex situation. The man's words echoed in his mind. The public has a right to know what's really happening behind these palace walls. The morning that had started as routine duty had transformed into something that would challenge everything Thomas believed about his role, his loyalty, and the institution he had devoted his life to serving. As he prepared to report the incident to his superiors, he couldn't help but wonder what other secrets might be hidden within the walls of the palace, and whether his unwavering loyalty to the crown was about to be tested in ways that would change his life forever. The documents scattered on the floor of Queen Camilla's study seemed to mock him with their secrets, and Thomas knew that whatever happened next, nothing would ever be the same again. The shocking revelation was only the beginning of a story that would soon explode beyond the confines of the palace walls and into the public consciousness in ways that no one could have predicted. The hours following Thomas's discovery of David Hartwell in Queen Camilla's private study moved with the swift precision of a military operation. Within minutes of Thomas's emergency call, the palace was swarming with security personnel, senior staff members, and officials whose very presence indicated the severity of the situation. The normally serene corridors echoed with urgent footsteps and hushed conversations as the full machinery of royal crisis management sprung into action. Thomas found himself in an unprecedented position. As the guard who had discovered the breach, he was simultaneously a hero for preventing further damage and a potential liability for having allowed the intruder access in the first place. The questioning that followed was intense and thorough, conducted by officials whose names Thomas had never heard but whose authority was unquestionable. David Hartwell had been removed from the premises within an hour, but not before security teams had conducted a comprehensive search of his person and belongings. The electronic device he had used to photograph the documents was confiscated, along with his briefcase, mobile phone, and even his clothing, which was replaced with standard prison-issue garments before he was transferred to an undisclosed location for interrogation. What troubled Thomas most was the reaction of the senior staff, when they examined the documents that Hartwell had been photographing. Instead of the relief he expected to see when the breach was contained, Thomas observed expressions of deep concern and what appeared to be fear. The documents were immediately sealed and removed by individuals who arrived within 30 minutes of the incident, suggesting that contingency plans for exactly this type of situation had been prepared well in advance. Commander Harrison Blake, the head of palace security, personally debriefed Thomas in a secure room deep within the administrative section of the palace. Blake was a career military officer with a reputation for absolute discretion and unwavering loyalty to the crown. His weathered face and steel-gray eyes had seen decades of service, and his presence at the debriefing indicated that this was not being treated as a routine security incident. "Thomas," Blake began, his voice carrying the weight of authority and concern, "I need you to understand that what happened today goes far beyond a simple security breach. The documents that were compromised contain information that could potentially cause significant damage to the monarchy if they were to become public." Thomas nodded, but his mind was still processing what he had glimpsed in those brief moments in the Queen's study. The fragments of text he had seen suggested financial arrangements and personal communications that seemed inconsistent with the public image of the royal family. The implications were staggering, and Thomas was beginning to understand why the response had been so swift and comprehensive. "Sir," Thomas said carefully, "the documents I saw, they appear to contain information about financial matters that I don't understand. Is there something I should know about the nature of what was compromised?" Blake's expression remained neutral, but Thomas caught a flicker of something, perhaps regret or concern, in the older man's eyes. "Thomas, your loyalty to the crown is not in question. Your service record speaks for itself, and your actions today prevented a potentially catastrophic breach of security. However, I need you to understand that some information is classified at levels that extend far beyond normal royal household operations." The conversation that followed would forever change Thomas's understanding of his role and the institution he served. Blake explained that the documents in Queen Camilla's study contained information related to financial arrangements that had been established decades ago, long before her marriage to the then Prince Charles. These arrangements involved offshore accounts, private investments, and financial structures that, while not illegal, could be misinterpreted by the public and the media. The Queen Consort has always been transparent about her financial affairs within the appropriate channels, Blake continued. However, the complexity of royal finances means that certain arrangements exist that serve legitimate purposes but could be taken out of context by those with malicious intent. Thomas listened intently, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was only receiving a carefully edited version of the truth. His glimpse of the actual documents had suggested something more significant than complex but legitimate financial arrangements. The references to personal communications and relationships within the royal family implied that the potential scandal extended beyond mere financial impropriety. "What about David Hartwell?" Thomas asked. How did he know where to find those specific documents? His behavior suggested he knew exactly what he was looking for and where to find it. Blake's expression darkened at the mention of Hartwell's name. "David Hartwell is not who he claimed to be. Our preliminary investigation has revealed that he has connections to certain media organizations and activist groups that have been attempting to gather compromising information about the royal family for several years. His access to information about the location and nature of those documents suggests that this was not an opportunistic breach, but part of a coordinated effort to expose private royal family information." The implications of Blake's words hit Thomas like a physical blow. He realized that he had been unwittingly drawn into what appeared to be a sophisticated intelligence operation targeting the royal family. The forged documentation that had convinced him to allow Hartwell access to the restricted area was evidence of extensive planning and resources that extended far beyond what a single individual could have managed alone. "Sir, are you saying that there are people actively working to gather compromising information about Queen Camilla and the royal family?" Thomas asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Thomas, what I'm telling you is that the monarchy faces threats that go far beyond physical security concerns. There are individuals and organizations that believe they could destabilize the crown by exposing information that, regardless of its context or legitimacy, could be used to damage public confidence in the royal family." Blake paused, studying Thomas's face carefully before continuing. The documents that were compromised today contain information about Queen Camilla's financial arrangements, personal communications, and relationships that could be taken out of context and used to suggest impropriety where none exists. However, the truth is often irrelevant when dealing with public perception and media manipulation. Thomas felt a growing sense of unease as he began to understand the full scope of what he had stumbled into. The security breach was not just about protecting private information. It was about protecting the very foundation of public trust that the monarchy relied upon for its continued existence. "What happens now?" Thomas asked, already dreading the answer. Blake's response was measured and serious. "Now, we work to contain the damage and ensure that this information does not reach the public. David Hartwell will be charged with breaking and entering, theft of private documents, and violations of the Official Secrets Act. However, our primary concern is determining how much information he was able to gather and whether he had opportunities to transmit any of it to his associates before he was apprehended." The conversation continued for another hour, during which Blake impressed upon Thomas the critical importance of absolute discretion about everything he had witnessed. Thomas was informed that he would be reassigned to different duties within the palace while the investigation continued, and that he should expect to be called for additional questioning as more information about the breach became available. As Thomas left the secure briefing room, his mind was reeling with the implications of what he had learned. The royal family he had devoted his life to protecting was apparently under attack from forces he had never imagined existed. The documents in Queen Camilla's study contained secrets that could potentially bring down the monarchy, and he had been the one person standing between those secrets and the people who wanted to expose them. Walking through the familiar corridors of the palace, Thomas noticed details that had never caught his attention before. Security cameras that he had always assumed were for protection now seemed like tools for surveillance. Staff members who had always been friendly colleagues now appeared to be watching him with newfound interest. The palace that had been his second home for 15 years suddenly felt like a fortress under siege. That evening, as Thomas sat in his modest flat in South London, he struggled to process everything that had happened. His wife, Sarah, noticed his distraction immediately, but when she asked about his day, Thomas found himself unable to share even the most basic details of what he had experienced. The weight of the secrets he now carried felt heavier than his ceremonial uniform, and far more burdensome than any physical duty he had ever performed. The documents scattered on Queen Camilla's study floor haunted his thoughts. The fragments of text he had glimpsed suggested financial arrangements that seemed inconsistent with public statements, personal communications that contradicted official positions, and relationships within the royal family that painted a different picture from the carefully maintained public image. As he lay awake that night, Thomas couldn't help but wonder whether his loyalty to the crown was about to be tested in ways that would force him to choose between his duty as a guard and his conscience as a citizen. The shocking revelation about Queen Camilla's secrets was only the beginning of a story that would soon spiral beyond anyone's control, and Thomas was beginning to realize that he might be the only person who could prevent a scandal that would shake the monarchy to its very foundations. 3 days after the security breach, Thomas Mitchell found himself in an impossible position that would test every principle he had lived by during his 15 years of royal service. The investigation into David Hartwell's infiltration had revealed disturbing details that went far beyond what Commander Blake had initially disclosed, and Thomas was beginning to understand that he had witnessed something that could fundamentally alter the public perception of Queen Camilla and the entire royal family. The morning briefing that changed everything took place in a windowless conference room in the basement of Buckingham Palace, a space that Thomas had never known existed despite his extensive knowledge of the building's layout. Present were Commander Blake, Deputy Private Secretary Margaret Thornfield, and 2 individuals who were introduced simply as consultants, but whose bearing and manner suggested connections to intelligence services that operated far beyond the palace walls. "Thomas," Blake began, his voice carrying a gravity that immediately put Thomas on high alert. "Our investigation into the Hartwell incident has revealed information that requires your immediate attention and complete discretion." The documents that Hartwell had photographed, Blake explained, contained evidence of financial arrangements that Queen Camilla had maintained since before her marriage to King Charles. These arrangements involved offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands and Switzerland that held assets worth an estimated £47 million, money that had never been declared to the relevant tax authorities or disclosed to the public as part of the royal family's official financial statements. The funds in question, Margaret Thornfield added, her crisp Oxford accent unable to disguise the concern in her voice, were accumulated through a series of business investments and property transactions that Queen Camilla conducted during her first marriage. While these activities were not illegal at the time, their continued concealment raises significant questions about transparency and tax compliance that could prove extremely damaging if made public. Thomas felt his world shifting beneath him as he processed this information. The Queen Consort, who had always been presented as a woman of modest means who brought little in terms of personal wealth to her marriage to the king, had apparently been concealing a fortune that rivaled the disclosed assets of some minor European monarchies. But the financial revelations were only the beginning of what Thomas would learn that morning. The documents in Queen Camilla's study had also contained correspondence that revealed the existence of ongoing relationships and financial arrangements with individuals who had been publicly distanced from the royal family due to their controversial backgrounds. The personal communications that were photographed, one of the unnamed consultants explained, include regular correspondence with Ghislaine Maxwell's former business associate Miranda Rothschild, ongoing financial support for Andrew Ferguson despite his public disgrace, and what appears to be coordination with offshore financial advisors who have been linked to money laundering investigations in 3 different countries. Thomas struggled to maintain his composure as the full scope of the scandal began to emerge. The Queen Consort was not just concealing personal wealth. She was apparently maintaining relationships and financial arrangements that could implicate her in activities that went far beyond mere tax avoidance. "Sir," Thomas said carefully, "are you telling me that Queen Camilla has been involved in criminal activities?" Blake exchanged glances with the other officials before responding. "What we're telling you, Thomas, is that the information contained in those documents could be interpreted in ways that would be extremely damaging to the monarchy. Whether the activities in question actually constitute criminal behavior would be a matter for legal authorities to determine, but the mere suggestion of impropriety could be enough to trigger a constitutional crisis." The conversation that followed revealed the true reason why Thomas had been called to this extraordinary briefing. The investigation had determined that David Hartwell had been working with a team of investigative journalists who had been gathering information about the royal family for over 2 years. The break-in at Queen Camilla's study was the culmination of an extensive operation that had involved infiltrating palace staff, intercepting private communications, and conducting surveillance of royal family members' private activities. "We have reason to believe," Margaret Thornfield continued, "that Hartwell's associates have additional information that they plan to release regardless of whether they obtain the documents he was attempting to photograph. Their goal appears to be the complete exposure of what they characterize as systemic corruption and deception within the royal household." Thomas felt a chill run down his spine as he realized the implications of what he was hearing. The security breach he had discovered was not an isolated incident, but part of a coordinated campaign to destroy the monarchy by exposing secrets that the royal family had gone to extraordinary lengths to keep hidden. "What does this have to do with me?" Thomas asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Blake's response confirmed Thomas's worst fears. "Thomas, you are the only person outside of senior royal household staff who has direct knowledge of the content of those documents and the circumstances of their compromise. Your testimony will be crucial in any legal proceedings that may result from this investigation." But there was more. The officials explained that they had reason to believe that Hartwell's associates might attempt to contact Thomas directly, either to gather additional information about what he had witnessed or to convince him to provide testimony that would support their narrative about royal family corruption. "We need you to understand," one of the consultants said, "that you may be approached by individuals who will present themselves as journalists, legal representatives, or even law enforcement officials. These individuals may offer you financial incentives or make threats against your family's safety in an attempt to secure your cooperation." The weight of the situation pressed down on Thomas as he realized that his discovery of the security breach had made him a target in a conflict that extended far beyond the palace walls. The royal guard, who had spent 15 years protecting the monarchy, was now being asked to help protect secrets that could potentially implicate Queen Camilla in activities that bordered on criminal. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" Thomas said, his voice betraying the internal conflict he was experiencing. Blake leaned forward, his steel-gray eyes meeting Thomas's directly. "Thomas, we're asking you to remember your oath of loyalty to the crown and to understand that sometimes protecting the monarchy requires protecting information that could be misunderstood or taken out of context by those who wish to cause harm. The conversation continued for another hour, during which Thomas was provided with detailed instructions about how to handle any contact from outside parties, procedures for reporting any suspicious activity around his home or family, and protocols for secure communication with palace security if he found himself in a compromised position. As the briefing concluded, Thomas was given a document to sign that acknowledged his understanding of the classified nature of the information he had been provided and his agreement to maintain absolute secrecy about all aspects of the investigation. The document also included language that suggested severe consequences for any breach of confidentiality, including potential prosecution under the Official Secrets Act. Walking through the palace corridors after the briefing, Thomas felt as though he was seeing everything for the first time. The portraits of previous monarchs that lined the walls seemed to be watching him with expressions of judgment and expectation. The ornate furnishings and priceless artifacts that had always filled him with pride now seemed like evidence of wealth and privilege that might have been built on foundations that were less noble than he had always believed. That evening, Thomas sat in his living room with his wife Sarah and their children, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy while processing the revelation that his entire understanding of the royal family had been fundamentally altered. Emily was practicing piano in the corner, playing the same piece that Queen Camilla had once inquired about during one of their brief encounters in the palace corridors. The irony of the situation was not lost on Thomas. The queen, who had shown interest in his daughter's musical education, was apparently concealing millions of pounds in offshore accounts, while maintaining relationships with individuals who had been implicated in financial crimes. The woman he had sworn to protect with his life was potentially involved in activities that could destroy the very institution he had devoted his career to serving. As he watched the children doing their homework and his wife preparing for her night shift to the hospital, Thomas realized that his loyalty to the crown was about to be tested in ways that would force him to choose between his duty as a royal guard and his responsibilities as a husband and father. The secrets he now carried could potentially provide financial security for his family if he chose to share them with the right people, but they could also destroy his career and reputation if he was perceived as betraying his oath of loyalty. The phone rang just as the family was sitting down to dinner, and Thomas felt his heart rate increase as he recognized the number as one he had never seen before. The officials had warned him that contact from outside parties might begin immediately, and Thomas realized that the relatively simple life he had built around his service to the crown was about to become infinitely more complicated. The shocking revelation about Queen Camilla's hidden wealth and suspicious relationships was only the beginning of a story that would soon force Thomas to make choices that would define not just his own future, but potentially the future of the monarchy itself. As he stared at the ringing phone, Thomas understood that everything he had believed about duty, loyalty, and service was about to be put to the ultimate test. The phone call that Thomas had been dreading came exactly 1 week after his extraordinary briefing in the basement of Buckingham Palace. He was at home on his day off, helping his daughter Emily with her mathematics homework, when his mobile phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, and terrifyingly well-informed about details of his life that no stranger should have known. "Mr. Mitchell," the voice said, "my name is Rebecca Harrison, and I'm a journalist with The Guardian. I believe you recently witnessed something at your workplace that would be of significant interest to the British public." Thomas's blood ran cold as he realized that the warnings he had received were becoming reality faster than anyone had anticipated. The journalist's knowledge of his involvement in the security breach was evidence that the information network surrounding the royal scandal extended far beyond what palace officials had suspected. "I'm not sure what you're referring to," Thomas replied, following the script he had been provided during his security briefing. "I'm not authorized to discuss any aspects of my work." Rebecca Harrison's laugh was knowing and slightly condescending. "Mr. Mitchell, we both know that's not entirely true. You've been carrying some very heavy secrets for the past week, and I imagine the weight of them is becoming quite difficult to bear." The conversation that followed would challenge every principle Thomas had lived by during his 15 years of royal service. Harrison revealed that her organization had been investigating Queen Camilla's financial arrangements for over 2 years and had accumulated evidence that went far beyond what David Hartwell had attempted to photograph in the Queen's private study. "We know about the £47 million in offshore accounts," Harrison said matter-of-factly. We know about the ongoing payments to Andrew Ferguson and the relationships with individuals who have been publicly distanced from the royal family. What we don't have is corroborating testimony from someone who has seen the actual documents that confirm these arrangements. Thomas felt trapped between his loyalty to the crown and a growing sense that the public might indeed have a right to know about the financial arrangements that Queen Camilla had been concealing. The journalist's professional manner and obvious knowledge of specific details suggested that the story would be published regardless of whether he provided cooperation. Mr. Mitchell, Harrison continued, I want you to understand that we're not interested in destroying the monarchy or causing unnecessary harm to your career. We're interested in accountability and transparency from public figures who are supported by taxpayer funds. The journalist explained that their investigation had revealed a pattern of financial arrangements within the royal household that suggested systematic avoidance of tax obligations and disclosure requirements that applied to other public figures. Queen Camilla's hidden wealth was apparently just one example of practices that have been ongoing for decades. The offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands and Switzerland are just the beginning, Harrison said. Our investigation has uncovered evidence of property investments, business partnerships, and financial arrangements that have allowed members of the royal family to accumulate and conceal wealth on a scale that would shock the British public. Thomas listened in growing disbelief as the journalist outlined evidence of financial arrangements that dwarfed even what he had been told during a security briefing. The royal family's official financial disclosures, which presented them as relatively modest in their personal wealth, were apparently carefully constructed to hide assets and income streams that totaled hundreds of millions of pounds. Why are you telling me this? Thomas asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Because, Mr. Mitchell, your testimony about what you witnessed in Queen Camilla's study would provide the final piece of evidence we need to publish a story that could fundamentally change how the British public views the monarchy. You have the opportunity to be part of ensuring accountability for people who have been deceiving the public for decades. The journalist's offer was both tempting and terrifying. She explained that their organization would provide legal protection for Thomas if he chose to provide testimony about what he had witnessed. They would also offer financial compensation that would be sufficient to ensure his family's security regardless of any consequences to his career in royal service. We're prepared to offer you £200,000 for your cooperation, Harrison said. That money would be placed in a secure trust that would provide for your children's education and your family's needs regardless of what happens to your current employment. Thomas felt the weight of impossible choices pressing down on him as he processed the journalist's offer. The money being offered represented more than 5 years of his current salary and would indeed provide security for his family that his royal guard position could never match. At the same time, accepting the offer would mean betraying everything he had believed about loyalty, duty, and service to the crown. I need time to think about this, Thomas said, his voice barely above a whisper. Harrison's response was understanding, but carried an undercurrent of urgency. Mr. Mitchell, I appreciate that this is not an easy decision. However, I need you to understand that we plan to publish our story within the next 2 weeks, regardless of whether you choose to provide cooperation. Your testimony would strengthen our reporting, but it's not essential for us to move forward. The conversation ended with Harrison providing Thomas with contact information and instructions for secure communication if he decided to provide cooperation. As Thomas hung up the phone, he realized that his quiet life as a royal guard was about to be irrevocably altered regardless of the choice he made. That evening, Thomas found himself unable to concentrate on anything other than the impossible decision he was facing. His wife, Sarah, noticed his distraction, but attributed it to work stress, having no idea that her husband was carrying secrets that could potentially destroy the monarchy and transform their family's circumstances forever. As he watched Emily practicing piano and James working on a school project about British history, Thomas was struck by the irony of his situation. His children were learning about the noble traditions of the monarchy, while their father was being asked to expose evidence that those traditions might be built on foundations of deception and financial manipulation. The internal conflict that Thomas was experiencing was unlike anything he had faced during his military career or his time in royal service. His training had prepared him to face physical threats and security challenges, but nothing had prepared him for a situation where his loyalty to the crown was in direct conflict with evidence of potential wrongdoing by the very people he had sworn to protect. Over the following days, Thomas found himself paying closer attention to news coverage of the royal family and public discussions about their role in British society. He began to notice criticism and questions that he had previously dismissed as tabloid sensationalism, but that now seemed to carry more weight in light of what he had learned about Queen Camilla's hidden financial arrangements. The public image of the royal family as modest servants of the British people began to seem like a carefully constructed facade that concealed a reality of immense wealth and privilege that was maintained through financial arrangements that bordered on deception. Thomas's role as a protector of that facade was becoming increasingly difficult to reconcile with his growing understanding of what he was actually protecting. The pressure from both sides continued to intensify as days passed. Commander Blake called Thomas for additional questioning about his recollections of the documents he had seen in Queen Camilla's study, while Rebecca Harrison sent discreet messages reminding him of the approaching deadline for publication of their investigation. Thomas realized that he was caught in a situation where any choice he made would have profound consequences for his family, his career, and potentially for the monarchy itself. The shocking revelation about Queen Camilla's hidden wealth had evolved into a test of everything Thomas believed about duty, loyalty, and responsibility to the truth. As he prepared for what he knew would be the most important decision of his life, Thomas understood that the relatively simple world of royal service he had inhabited for 15 years was about to be replaced by something infinitely more complex and dangerous. The tension that had been building since his discovery of David Hartwell in the Queen's study was about to explode in ways that would affect not just his own life, but the future of the British monarchy itself. The weight of secrets that could change history rested on the shoulders of a man who had never wanted anything more than to serve his country with honor and dignity. Thomas Mitchell was about to discover that sometimes the most patriotic act might be the one that appears most treasonous, and that protecting the crown might require exposing the very secrets that the crown desperately wanted to keep hidden. The moment of reckoning arrived on a cold Monday morning in November, when Thomas Mitchell made a decision that would forever change his life and potentially alter the course of British history. After 2 weeks of sleepless nights, agonizing internal debate, and careful consideration of the consequences for his family and his country, Thomas walked into the Guardian's offices in King's Cross with a determination that surprised even himself. Rebecca Harrison met him in a secure conference room that was equipped with recording equipment and legal documentation that would protect both Thomas and the newspaper from potential retaliation. Present were 3 senior editors, 2 lawyers, and a security consultant whose presence indicated the gravity of the situation they were all entering. "Mr. Mitchell," Harrison said as Thomas took a seat at the polished conference table, "are you certain that you want to proceed with providing testimony about what you witnessed at Buckingham Palace?" Thomas nodded, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to do. "I've spent 15 years protecting the royal family, and I've always believed that my loyalty to the crown was the same as my loyalty to the British people. I'm beginning to understand that those 2 loyalties might not always be the same thing." The testimony that Thomas provided over the next 6 hours was devastating in its detail and implications. He described exactly what he had seen in Queen Camilla's private study, the specific documents that David Hartwell had been photographing, and the content of his subsequent briefings with palace security officials. The financial arrangements that Thomas described painted a picture of systematic deception that went far beyond what even the Guardian's extensive investigation had uncovered. The documents he had seen contained evidence of not just the £47 million in offshore accounts, but additional financial structures that appeared designed to conceal the true extent of Queen Camilla's personal wealth. The documents showed bank statements from accounts in Switzerland, the Cayman Islands, and Jersey. Thomas testified, his voice growing stronger as he provided details that had been haunting him for weeks. The total amount in these accounts appeared to be closer to £80 million, not the $47 million that I was told during my briefing with Commander Blake. But the financial revelations were only part of the story that Thomas was able to provide. The personal communications he had glimpsed revealed a pattern of relationships and financial arrangements that suggested Queen Camilla had been actively involved in managing assets and investments that were inconsistent with her public image as someone who had brought modest wealth to her marriage to the king. There were letters and emails that showed regular communication with financial advisors who had been involved in money laundering investigations. Thomas continued. There were also documents that appeared to show ongoing financial support for individuals who had been publicly distanced from the royal family, including payments that totaled several £1 million over the past 5 years. The most damaging revelation in Thomas's testimony involved evidence of coordination between Queen Camilla and other members of the royal family to conceal financial arrangements that had been in place since before her marriage to King Charles. The documents suggested that the king himself had been aware of and involved in maintaining the offshore accounts that had never been disclosed to tax authorities or included in official financial statements. One of the documents I saw was a letter from King Charles to Queen Camilla discussing the need to maintain operational security around our financial arrangements until the parliamentary inquiry concludes, Thomas testified. This suggested that they were both aware that their financial practices could not withstand official scrutiny. As Thomas's testimony continued, the full scope of the royal family's deception became clear. The modest lifestyle that they presented to the public was apparently maintained while concealing wealth that rivaled that of some small nations. The charitable work and public service that formed the foundation of their public image were being conducted while they avoided tax obligations that would have provided significant funding for the very public services they claimed to support. The Guardian's lawyers worked throughout Thomas's testimony to verify the details he was providing against evidence they had already gathered from other sources. The consistency between Thomas's account and their independent investigation provided the corroboration they needed to publish a story that would fundamentally challenge public perception of the monarchy. Mr. Mitchell, one of the senior editors, said as the formal testimony concluded, "You understand that publication of this story will likely result in significant scrutiny of your own actions and motivations. Are you prepared for the personal consequences that may result from your decision to come forward?" Thomas had spent weeks considering exactly this question, and his answer reflected the internal journey he had undertaken since discovering David Hartwell in Queen Camilla's study. "I joined the Royal Guard because I believed in service to my country and protection of institutions that represent the best of British values. I've come to understand that sometimes protecting those institutions requires exposing the people who are corrupting them." The conversation that followed addressed the practical aspects of Thomas's situation and the protection that the Guardian would provide for him and his family. Legal experts explained that his testimony would be protected under whistleblower legislation, but that he should expect intensive investigation of his own background and motivations by palace officials and their legal representatives. 3 days after Thomas's testimony was provided to the Guardian, the story was published as the front-page headline. Royal Guard reveals Queen Camilla's hidden millions. Exclusive investigation exposes offshore accounts and secret financial arrangements. The impact was immediate and devastating. Within hours of publication, Buckingham Palace was forced to issue a statement acknowledging that Queen Camilla maintained certain private financial arrangements, but denying any wrongdoing or illegal activity. The statement was widely viewed as inadequate and defensive, and it prompted immediate calls for a parliamentary investigation into royal family finances. Thomas watched the explosion of media coverage from his home in South London, where he was now under around-the-clock police protection due to threats that had been made against his family. The story had triggered exactly the constitutional crisis that Commander Blake had warned about, and Thomas was beginning to understand the full implications of his decision to speak publicly about what he had witnessed. The royal family's response to the revelations was swift and comprehensive. Queen Camilla issued a personal statement acknowledging that she had maintained offshore accounts, but claiming that all arrangements had been properly managed by professional advisors and that any tax implications had been addressed through appropriate channels. However, the damage to public confidence was immediate and severe. Opinion polls showed a dramatic decline in support for the monarchy, with a majority of respondents expressing anger about the concealment of wealth while public services faced budget cuts. Protest demonstrations outside Buckingham Palace attracted thousands of participants demanding greater transparency and accountability from the royal family. Thomas found himself at the center of a national debate about loyalty, duty, and the public's right to know about the financial arrangements of people who were supported by taxpayer funds. Some viewed him as a heroic whistleblower who had exposed corruption at the highest levels of British society. Others saw him as a traitor who had betrayed his oath of loyalty for personal gain. The investigation that followed Thomas's revelations ultimately led to the establishment of a parliamentary committee charged with conducting a comprehensive review of royal family finances. Queen Camilla was required to provide detailed documentation of all her financial arrangements, and the offshore accounts that had been concealed for decades were finally subjected to official scrutiny. 6 months after Thomas's decision to provide testimony to the Guardian, the parliamentary investigation concluded that while no criminal activity had been identified, the royal family had indeed concealed significant assets and had failed to meet disclosure requirements that applied to other public figures. The committee recommended comprehensive reforms to royal financial management and new transparency requirements that would prevent similar concealment in the future. Thomas Mitchell, the royal guard who had discovered a shocking palace secret about Queen Camilla, had ultimately succeeded in forcing accountability from an institution that had operated for centuries with minimal oversight. The explosion of tension that had followed his revelations had fundamentally changed the relationship between the monarchy and the British people, establishing new standards of transparency and accountability that would shape the future of the crown. As Thomas began a new career in private security, supported by the financial compensation he had received for his testimony, he reflected on the journey that had taken him from loyal royal guard to public whistleblower. The shocking revelation that had begun with his discovery of David Hartwell in Queen Camilla's study had evolved into a transformation of British constitutional arrangements that would have lasting implications for generations to come. The palace secret that Thomas had been asked to protect had ultimately been exposed, not because of his disloyalty, but because of his deeper loyalty to principles of truth and accountability that transcended his duty to any individual or institution. In choosing to speak publicly about what he had witnessed, Thomas had redefined what it meant to serve the crown in a modern democracy where transparency and accountability were no longer optional for those who held positions of public trust.